Hello, and thank you very much for agreeing to do an online professional development session with me for the next 2 weeks. My understanding is that several of you will be viewing the videos each evening and then returning to school the next day to talk with your colleagues about things that happen in the videos. Please email me with anything that you find in the video that's helpful, and then also any questions that you might have. And my goal is to keep these videos very short, and hopefully they will help you as you are preparing your students for end of the year exams. So I know that right now I'm preparing my own students for end of the year exams, and the lessons that I'm going to share across these 8 to 10 videos are lessons that I'm doing with my own students. So to just get right to the lesson, today I want to share a lesson about reminding our students about genre and talking with them about the importance of why we identify genre and how we use genre. So it's not just identifying, but then once we can identify the genre, how do we use that to build our comprehension, to make meaning of what we're reading? So I say to my students, and I'll start the lesson and I'm just going to talk with you like I'm talking to my students. So anyone that tells me that genre is very easy to identify and navigate through, I become a little suspicious of, because in my opinion, genre is extremely complicated. And the reality is most books that we read are multiple genres. What I've come to decide to help me as I'm navigating genre is I think about it in there's either fiction or nonfiction. And fiction, is there are a lot more names, a lot more ways of defining fiction, meaning there's mystery, there's historical fiction, there's science fiction, poetry can be fiction. So on the fiction side, there's lots of different ways that we define the different types of fiction. On the other side is nonfiction. And sometimes it's called literary nonfiction, sometimes it's called narrative nonfiction. And the big thing that I've come to realize myself as a reader, it's either fake or it's real. And it can feel like it's real on the fiction side when it's realistic fiction. The historical fiction can feel very real because the history in it is real. The poetry can feel very real even though it might be fictional characters inside of the poem. But it's fiction and it's not real. There are fake components to it. On the literary nonfiction, I just say to myself, everything in this text, this book or this magazine, this passage, everything has to be real for it to be on that side. And I might use the same strategies to read fiction or nonfiction. In fact, I do use a lot of the same strategies. However, when I'm navigating nonfiction as opposed to navigating fiction, I use the elements of genre in a way to make meaning inside of that text. So for example, here are 3 different types of books. So I have Who Was Neil Armstrong? I have Charlotte's Web, and then I have Encyclopedia Brown. So one thing that I look at as I read these books is I will know as I read them, do I put them to the fiction side or do I put them to the nonfiction side? So I'm going to pick up Encyclopedia Brown, and when I look at the cover, I think to myself, okay, it looks real, and sometimes literary nonfiction pictures are not necessarily real, but they look so real that we know everything in the text is real. So I look to the back, match wits with the super sleuth and sneakers, a bandana burger, a roach that's ready to race. Okay, don't miss any of the other books about Encyclopedia Brown. So I'm thinking this is realistic fiction, just because it also says here, these are just some of the 10 brain-twisting mysteries Encyclopedia Brown must solve by using its famous computer-like brain. It could be real, but I'm going to read the table of contents. Let me see here. The table of contents. The case of the slippery salamander, the case of the bandana burglar, the case of the dead cockroach. Now, as much as I might want all of this to be real with Encyclopedia Brown, I'm thinking that it feels real, but it's probably not real. Let's see. I'm going to read the case of the slippery salamander. To a visitor, Idaville looked like an ordinary seaside town. It had churches, 2 car washes, 3 movie theaters. It had bike paths, sparkling white beaches, a synagogue, and plenty of good fishing spots. But there was something out of the ordinary about Idaville. For more than a year, no child or grown-up had gotten away with breaking a law. From coast to coast, people wanted to know, how did Idaville do it? The secret resided in a red brick house at 13 Rover Avenue. That was where Idaville's police chief lived with his wife and son. Chief Brown was a smart, kind, and brave man, but he wasn't the one who kept crooks from getting away with their crimes. No, the brains behind it all was his 10-year-old son, Encyclopedia. Encyclopedia's real name was Leroy, but only his parents and teachers called him that. Everyone else called him Encyclopedia because his brain was filled with more facts than a reference book. Sometimes the Brown family was tempted to tell the world about Encyclopedia's amazing talent as a crime solver, but so far they hadn't leaked a word. For one thing, the Browns didn't like to boast. For another, who would believe that Idaville's top detective was a 5th grader? One night, Chief Brown sat at the dinner table staring at his plate of spaghetti. So far, he hadn't slurped up a single strand. Encyclopedia and his mother knew the reason. The chief wasn't eating because he had come up against a crime that he couldn't solve. Okay, so even though I'm looking at this picture and it looks very real, as I'm reading this story, from what I know about genre, is realistic fiction feels really like it could happen. But I'm guessing that there really isn't a 10-year-old boy who solves all the crimes. So I'm going to use this. I'm going to use the elements of fiction. There's going to be characters, there's going to be a setting, there's going to be a plot to make meaning. Now, this is where genre gets very complicated. It's realistic fiction, but it's also mystery because it seems like Encyclopedia Brown that there is some sort of unsolved case and he solves the cases throughout the story. So do we see that how fiction can be so complicated? So not only am I looking for the realistic side of it to use the elements of a family and some problems that they have, but now I know that it's mystery, and when I read mystery, I'm looking to see pieces of the crime and look at the crime and see all the little pieces of the information that's given, and I put them together to try and solve the mystery. So another book that I like to show my students is Who Was Neil Armstrong? So looking at the cover and knowing that these Who Was books are biographies, I already enter this book getting my mind ready for biography. And I know that biographies, everything has to be real. So as I'm reading it, I'll read this one page here. From the time he was a little boy, Neil was fascinated by airplanes and flying. When he was just a toddler, he saw an air show in Cleveland, Ohio with his dad. Neil took his first plane ride when he was only 6. The plane was called the Tin Goose. It wasn't really made out of tin. Its strong body was made of aluminum. The Tin Goose could carry up to 12 passengers who sat on scratchy wicker seats. Its engine rattled and roared as the Goose reached a little over 100 miles an hour. Later on, Neil's father confessed that he had been scared to death. As for Neil, he had enjoyed every single minute. So then I turn the page and it goes on to and explains the first airplane. The Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, grew up in Dayton, Ohio, near where Neil Armstrong was born. Like Neil, they were interested in anything that flew from the time they were kids. They made paper toys that they called bats, which would guide on air currents. So I'm reading this and it feels like a story, and I'm looking at the pictures and they're not actually real pictures, but they look real. So it's kind of like Encyclopedia Brown. They both have the feeling of a story. But what I'm realizing and what's going on in my mind is these are facts. This is telling the story of a real person. I'm learning about Neil Armstrong. And I'm probably going to learn about the things that happened in his life that got him to where he was and where he became famous, that he was an astronaut. So his childhood events, as he went across the decades, his interest in aeronautical engineering started when he was just a little child and he flew in a real airplane called the Tin Goose. So everything in here is fact. Everything in here is for me to learn about Neil Armstrong, possibly to be inspired by Neil Armstrong. Different than Encyclopedia Brown. Encyclopedia Brown, a good story, getting my mind ready to solve a mystery with him. Neil Armstrong sounds like a story, feels like a story, but everything is absolutely real. And everything in here is for me to learn about him and to be inspired by him. So looking at Charlotte's Web, I'm thinking to myself, so the Encyclopedia Brown was realistic fiction. The Neil Armstrong book was a biography. They both felt like stories. Now I have to decide by looking at the back cover, by looking at the front cover, and thinking to myself, when I read, I wonder, is this all real or is this fiction? And so I'm just going to read the first page and get my mind thinking about what I know about genre. Is it real? Is it fake? If it's fake, what type of fiction is it? Chapter 1, Before Breakfast. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. "Out to the hog house," replied Mrs. Arable. "Some pigs were born last night." "I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern, who was only 8. "Well," said her mother, "one of the pigs is a runt. It's very small and weak, and it will never amount to anything. So your father has decided to do away with it." "Do away with it?" shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it?" "Just because it's smaller than the others?" Mrs. Arable put a pitcher of cream on the table. "Don't yell, Fern," she said. "Your father is right. The pig would probably die anyway." Fern pushed her chair back out of the way and ran outdoors. The grass was wet and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping by the time she caught up with her father. "Please, please don't kill it," she sobbed. "It's unfair." Mr. Arable stopped walking. "Fern," he said gently, "you will have to learn to control yourself." "Control myself?" yelled Fern. "This is a matter of life and death, and you talk about controlling myself?" So I'm going to stop there. Now, it feels very real. And there's lots of dialogue, and there are characters, there are people talking back and forth. This definitely is a realistic fiction book. I'm pretty sure of it, because one of the characteristics of realistic fiction is it feels real. The characters could happen, and usually authors choose to add a lot of dialogue, and they choose to create a plot. And this story is so fantastic because right away we meet 3 characters, and right away we're jumped right into the plot. And we actually even can infer the setting is on a farm because they're talking about pigs and pigs that were born last night. So it's throwing us into a story. So readers, what I really want you to walk away with thinking is when you sit down to read, when I sit down to read, I have to really get my mind set as to what genre it is that I'm reading, because we do navigate the genres, we do navigate with what we're reading by using the components of that genre. So when I'm reading realistic fiction, I'm looking for the characters, I'm looking to get to know them through the dialogue and through what they say and their actions of what they do. I'm looking for the setting, and I'm looking for a plot to develop where probably there's a problem, just like in Charlotte's Web. In Encyclopedia Brown, the characters were there, the setting was there, and it really described that setting. And then it went right into the plot that they solve all of the crimes, and Encyclopedia Brown is the one that solves it. So it gets my mind ready to use those elements of fiction, the character, the setting, the plot, to make meaning of what I'm reading. Whereas Neil Armstrong was different. it sounded like a story, but there were facts put in there. It told us the fact that when he went to a fair when he was very little with his father, he got to fly in a real airplane, and his father was so nervous, but it worked out and it sparked this interest. And then there's also, it goes into facts of who were the first people to fly in airplanes, and it talks about the Orwell brothers or the Wright brothers. So knowing this, as I read this, I'm looking for facts to learn all about Neil Armstrong and all about probably airplanes and leading into what it's like to be an astronaut. So that's the first lesson in this series of the online professional development. And I hope that it is helpful, that starting with day one, when we start a mini unit with our students, preparing them to take these exams, circling back to the basics will help our students to get their minds ready. When they sit down to read anything right away, with automaticity, they're thinking, okay, what genre am I reading? Okay, what are the elements of nonfiction? What are the elements of fiction? Is there a specific type of fiction? Are there more than one different types of fiction put together to make this passage? I hope this was helpful. I look forward to getting your emails, and I will post another video tomorrow. Thank you so much.